I was in Washington, D.C. for work last week, and it was an interesting experience. Walking among the historical monuments, the places built to inspire national pride and admiration, yet at a time when many of us have struggled to feel a sense of connection, much less pride with this country. And walking among those places, steeped in history and towering figures, I found myself wondering, how would those figures, the founding fathers, the leaders of years and centuries past, how would they respond to these strange and challenging days? What would they say if I could walk with them along the National Mall? Would they be proud of what we've become? Or would they be shocked, grieved, maybe even bewildered? What if I could talk with them, with George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, maybe even Abraham Lincoln, the man who carried the torch of those founding ideals through our nation's darkest hour? How would they think about the main issues facing America today? Not just the headlines, but the deeper divides and fractures underneath. The anger, the distrust, the feeling that we're not just divided into two political parties, but two entirely separate realities. What would they make of today's America? To Washington, the man who refused to be king, I think he would likely see the degree of today's partisanship as the realization of one of his greatest fears. In his farewell address towards the close of his presidency, Washington urged the country to resist political factions, warning that they would become potent engines for ill-founded jealousies and open the door to foreign influence and domestic convulsions. He believed unity, national identity above party loyalty, was essential to preserving the republic. If Washington can see today's landscape, where neighbors often cannot even speak to each other because of political signs on their lawns, where vitriolic rhetoric dominates and is often rewarded in public discourse, I think he'd passionately urge us to recalibrate. He would remind us that patriotism is not party loyalty, that to disagree politically is not to be enemies, but that democracy depends on something bigger than red versus blue. It depends on the health of we, the people. What about Thomas Jefferson? He distrusted centralized power and championed individual liberty. He believed in the power of the people, the farmers, the thinkers, the free press. If Jefferson were here today, he'd likely resonate with conservatives' calls for limited government, but he would just as surely recognize the liberal emphasis on individual rights, individual liberty, speech, and equal justice. So today's political parties hotly contesting ideas wouldn't concern Jefferson. He welcomed debate. But what would unsettle him is that polarization has become fueled not by reasoned argument, but by monolithic media ecosystems, algorithmic tribalism, and a political culture that rewards outrage over dialogue. It's not the existence of debate that would worry Jefferson. It's the collapse of genuine inquiry, the rise of emotional and informational echo chambers. To this, Jefferson would probably plead that we develop a well-informed country. He believed that an educated, morally serious citizenry was the immune system of the republic. As he put it, a well-instructed people alone can be permanently free people. He would urge us to build an education system and a civic culture that inoculates against polarization by fostering critical thinking, humility, and empathy. He would also remind us that I never considered a difference of opinion in politics, in religion, in philosophy as a cause for withdrawing from a friend. What about James Madison, the primary architect of the Constitution? He would likely find today's climate also alarming. But to be sure, Madison expected political differences. He believed liberty required faction. In Federalist Number 10, he wrote, "At the latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man." People will always disagree. The genius of the Constitution, Madison believed, was that it created a system where ambition would counteract ambition, a structure designed to force compromise. But Madison's system assumes something I think we've since lost: a shared foundation of truth. A faction he believed was survivable so long as it was bounded by reasoned thought and constitutional order. When those bounds are overwhelmed, when one side no longer trusts elections without any evidence, or when public discourse is flooded with bad faith and disinformation, the system begins to corrode from within. Today, the checks and balances Madison designed are too often bypassed by monetized tribalism, gerrymandering, and a media ecosystem that rewards rage over reason. Furthermore, here in early 2025, we even see congressional Republicans who once decried executive overreach now standing silent when clear abuses come from their own side. And Madison would likely call for urgent reforms: independent redistricting, fairer voting access, media platforms held accountable for algorithmic distortion, but most importantly, a more educated and civically enlightened citizenry. Because for Madison, democracy was never automatic. It had to be tended deliberately, diligently, and constantly. What about Alexander Hamilton? Not just a Broadway hip-hop star, but the nation's first Treasury Secretary. Hamilton believed in building strong commerce, robust infrastructure, a federal government powerful enough to protect national interests. He would likely sympathize with liberal calls for investment in education, clean energy, and infrastructure, but he'd also caution about reckless spending. He'd encourage fiscal discipline, long-term thinking, and he'd likely call out both parties for short-term political wins at the cost of national stability. Hamilton was flawed, but he understood a truth that feels lost today. We need government not just to exist, but to function. And then there's Lincoln, the man who said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." Lincoln knew what it meant to hold a country together at the brink of collapse. And he did it not by demonizing his opponents, but by appealing to the better angels of our nature. In the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln didn't call for victory. He called for a new birth of freedom. He called on Americans, all Americans, to be worthy of the sacrifices made for liberty. Today, Lincoln would tell us probably the real threat is not the other party. The real threat is the erosion of empathy, the belief that only those who agree with us are real Americans. So what would the founders and past leaders say to us now? I think they would say, stop fighting the wrong war. It's not about left versus right. It's about honest governance versus corruption. It's community versus contempt. It's truth versus manipulation. They would remind us that America was never about perfect agreement. It was about perfecting the union. That democracy doesn't mean shouting the loudest. It means listening, compromising when possible, and belonging to each other, even when we disagree. They would tell us that living up to these hallowed grounds and honoring the sacrifices that built them depends on our day-to-day behavior, with how we treat people we disagree with the courage to speak the truth and the humility to hear it, with a patriotism that doesn't just wave flags, but builds bridges. Because the founders, they didn't just give us a country, they gave us a question: can we keep it?